Hello all, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at Trump's presidential commission investigating theft of the 2020 election, or more accurately, the conspicuous lack of said commission. Considering that Trump's made efforts to take down an ever-growing list of perceived enemies who've wronged him over the years, like John Bolton and James Comey, and considering that he formed a presidential commission to investigate the 2016 election, it seems at the very least like a glaring oversight that there's been no mention whatsoever of a presidential inquiry into the most colossal injustice ever endured by not just Trump, but every American citizen that took shape in theft of the 2020 election. And why was this the most profound injustice ever inflicted on Americans? Well, to give the issue a little context, alongside the core rights of democracy like voting, forming juries, or free speech, the peaceful transfer of power is among the most fundamental of American values. Even if it's a battle waged up to the present day, America was the first nation ever founded on the universal, objective morals that apply to all humans across all time. Its founding the first to declare that might doesn't make right. That's what made America's founding so radically different and unprecedented. Plenty of nations had been founded on religion, monarchy, pretend democracy, but this was the first one ever founded on universal human rights, a concept that seems common now, but in the late 1700s it was gaining traction for the first time in history. Contemporary philosopher Richard Price, aka the wisest Welshman to have ever lived, called America's founding a new era in the history of mankind, and said it was the most significant event since the birth of Christ, a religion also once concerned with objective morals. That's precisely why so many across the West became so convinced that American democracy was an unstoppable force that was on course to envelop the entire globe, because it was the first nation to ever tap the vein of humanity's titanic combined power. President Washington's peaceful transfer of power to John Adams was the first real test of the American democratic experiment, and has since been hailed as one of the most profound events in human history because it ended 12,000 years of global horror and relentless bloodshed from the eternal struggle for power for the right to rule over others, starting somewhere around the dawn of agriculture. And not that there weren't similar struggles for power prior, but that was when it first started taking place on a much larger scale. Washington's peaceful transfer of power is what makes him such a genuinely profound individual despite his many glaring faults. President Reagan referred to the peaceful transfer of power with, "This every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle." And he was absolutely right, because it's one of the all too rare examples of humans subduing their nature. America's founding fathers were students of history and tyranny as subjects of England's, quote, Mad King George III, and many were quite familiar with the deficits and defects in human nature, though Adams and Hamilton seem a little hazy on the issue. They were accordingly wary of human proclivities for power, and because of that, many of the founding fathers found the act of campaigning for office to be a blatantly immoral act, particularly for the presidency, as the type of person who wants that type of power, the type of person who sees themselves as so morally, cognitively, and socially elevated over their fellow citizens, the type of person who sees themselves as being deserving of the office isn't fit for it. Instead, they wrote a lot of letters and met with various small groups to drum up support from their potential constituents. At least on the political stage, publicly rejecting that problematic and all too common lust for power brought Washington to resign as commander of the armed forces following the American Revolution, and gave him anxieties that making it apparent that he intended to run for office would make it look like he assumed the American public wanted him to. Regardless, human nature did manage to weasel its way back into American elections, and a number have been contested over the years. For example, 1824, Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, with Quincy desperate to outshine his dad, founding father John Adams. He seems to have schemed with Congress to hand him the election, despite Jackson having won the popular and the electoral vote, some claiming that he sold his soul for the presidency. Quincy's election marked the end of America's age of good feelings, when the population had just one political party, leading to the birth of the Democrats, and, like his father, serving just one term as president. Next, we have 1860. Abe Lincoln annihilates the 70-year monopoly that the South had on the presidency and the Supreme Court. 11 states reject his victory and instead adopt Confederate President Jefferson Davis, soon followed by the Civil War and leading to the death of well over 500,000 Americans. Next up is 1876, Sam Tilden versus Rutherford Hayes. Election results are disputed in 4 states due to ballot shenanigans and extreme violence toward Republican voters. Congress and the Supreme Court team up to decide the election, maybe making a deal with Hayes where, in exchange for the presidency, he conspires to end Reconstruction in the South, aka the decade following the Civil War, where Congress tried to implement the system of objective values that America was founded on by passing 3 amendments to the Constitution, often called America's second founding. They hand Hayes the victory by a single electoral vote. He becomes the second president in U.S. history to lose the popular vote, and the South largely reverts to its pre-Civil War social structures, its heinous pre-Civil War social structure. Could you imagine our Congress passing 3 amendments? Finally, we have the 2000 election, Gore v. Bush, despite Al Gore having won the popular vote by over 500,000 ballots, and despite the Constitution explicitly assigning Congress the duty of refereeing questionable election results, the U.S. Supreme Court unilaterally ends ballot recounts and hands Bush the presidency, followed by the Iraq War and many trillions in national debt. So yeah, America has seen some shady elections. Which brings us to the 2020 election. Trump still calls stolen at every opportunity, with much of Congress and the U.S. population believing likewise. To put this allegedly stolen election in context, though Republicans had been in power since Trump's election in 2016, they hadn't managed to gain enough power over the arms of government to prevent the Democrats from stealing the 2020 election, almost certainly suffering at the hands of a perpetually elusive and seemingly indestructible deep state. Yet somehow those same Democrats, after having been in power for 4 years and having demonstrated their total void of morals by having stolen the previous election and consequently having destroyed American democracy, weren't capable of rigging the 2024 election. Weird. And just as an aside, I personally, quite foolishly, assumed that Trump's win in the 2024 election would be the end of the stolen election conspiracies, as it seemed the logic was so painfully and glaringly obvious that no one could possibly miss it. But some are claiming that his 2024 win is somehow evidence that the 2020 election was stolen, which really just demonstrates the tragic lengths that people are willing to go to when they're motivated to believe something. So it seems a little suspicious that Trump, the most vindictive man on the planet, a man who holds grudges indefinitely, a man who suffered at the hands of the January 6th committee, a man wronged by many federal judges that he appointed who ruled against him in his lawsuit seeking to overturn the 2020 election, a man who's repeatedly demonstrated his undying lust for theatrics, drama, and attention, hasn't expressed the slightest interest in forming a presidential commission to make pariahs of the people who stole his righteous glory. He has the opportunity to choreograph the greatest act of political theater that the world's ever seen, and to show the globe just how deeply he's been wrong, but hasn't even hinted that such a commission is even on the horizon. It seems a little out of character. Stacked with the full and overwhelming investigative powers of Congress, DOJ, FBI, having installed grossly obsequious sycophants in each, and given that the stolen election is accepted as fact to such an extent that it's being taught to children in our nation's schools, Americans don't just deserve to know the names of the traitors who inflicted one of the most profound crimes in U.S. history. Americans don't just deserve to see them imprisoned and their proverbial heads on pikes, but we deserve unassailable assurance that such a heinous act of treachery never happens again. He's found time to call for charges against Obama and Hillary for their actions surrounding the 2016 election. He's found time to have his DOJ bring charges against James Comey and Jack Smith, not even including the January 6th mob. He's found time to pardon dozens of officials who made direct efforts to overturn the 2020 election, while firing the people who investigated them. But it's been over 5 years, and not only have there been no charges against any individuals or organizations relating to theft of the 2020 election, but there hasn't been a single shred of evidence that the election was stolen accepted as factual by anyone outside of his most ardent supporters. To suppose that such a vast conspiracy is true, to suppose that more than half the country has been walking around with blinders on for years now, many centrists and Republicans included, is so far outside the realm of reality as to not even warrant discussion. The closest thing to evidence that anyone's been able to conjure up comes in the form of a pseudo-documentary from one Dinesh D'Souza, a man who's been a raging charlatan and douchebag for decades. Seriously though, look him up. Watch his debates with Christopher Hitchens. He's one of the purest examples of a sophist I've ever seen, right alongside J.D. Vance, Vivek Ramaswamy, Steve Bannon, i.e. exceedingly intelligent men who are convinced that you are exceedingly stupid. And though Trump's called on others to investigate the 2020 election, it seems a little odd that a man so enamored with the powers of the presidency, often using them in ways explicitly denied by the Constitution, a man who found it necessary necessary to form a commission on election integrity in 2017, hasn't used the powers that he does have to form a new presidential commission to investigate the 2020 election. Aside from Trump, Congress too seems to have little interest in rooting out the villains responsible for the supposed election caper. A Congress that's found time to investigate UFOs, laptops, Matt Gaetz, hasn't expressed even minor interest in forming a committee to hunt down the criminals who stole an election, a deafening conspiracy of silence. A Congress just as infatuated with revenge, theatrics, attention as Trump seemingly hasn't even considered forming a counterpoint to the January 6th committee that they spent so much time berating. And what seems particularly bizarre to me, or maybe not so surprising considering their seeming boundless ineptitude, is that the feckless Democrats haven't said a word about it either. If they're so convinced that the election wasn't stolen, why aren't they demanding an investigation from the Republicans, even completely run by Republicans, that would turn up nothing and finally conclusively prove to the American population that Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election were driven by nothing more than a grossly immoral, insatiable lust for personal power? With Trump's one-time confidants claiming that he acknowledged the loss in private, the total lack of an investigative commission from Trump makes it seem like he is, and perhaps always was, aware of his loss in 2020. Were that true, the dozens of lawsuits that he launched attempting to overturn the election would be a gross misuse of taxpayer dollars, let alone time of public servants. Were that true, his $230 million demanded in compensation from the DOJ would be an outright theft from American taxpayers. And as a man who's quite openly made accumulating money his ultimate life goal, were he actually convinced that the lawsuits against him were baseless, it seemed a little suspect that he didn't demand compensation much sooner, like immediately. Were that true, it would seem to fall right in line with his past behaviors now that he's threatened tariffs, revoked funding, and outright violence in ways intended to manipulate elections and leadership in countries like Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil, Greenland, Canada, or closer to home in his threats to rescind funding over city and state elections. Were that true, his responsibility for the events of January 6th would be among the most morally revolting actions ever committed by a US president, and he certainly has a fair amount of competition in that area. And the really heartbreaking thing about this whole situation is that so much of the US population was and is so not just willing, but eager to be duped. Though many Western thinkers like Polybius had mentioned it prior, Niccolo Machiavelli, perhaps the greatest political strategist of all time, warned over 500 years ago that when populations feel as though they have little to lose, they become more susceptible to opportunistic demagogues who have no other greater calling in life than advancing their own power. And Trump is a demagogue by definition. The real problem isn't a stolen election, it's that America's so-called leaders and representatives at the city, state, and federal levels have come to a total dereliction of duty. Many have gone much further and are actively working against you, Republicans and Democrats alike. Cheer for your party all you want, push their trash ideologies all you want, hate the other party all you want, but recognize that doing so only reinforces the problems that America is facing, and recognize that both parties are equally culpable in abandoning Americans. Political parties don't mean much when billionaires and their media companies decide who's fit for the ballot, empowered by a Supreme Court that's given those billionaires unfettered freedom when it comes to funding the candidates who will serve them best, always leaving Americans to vote for the lesser of two evils, cheering on the one that's least repugnant. The outcome has been a glut of U.S. representatives who've sold the U.S. population to the medical, housing, educational, banking, food industries, just to name a few. The outcome has been elected officials held to unbelievably low standards where corruption is the norm, once again thanks to a Supreme Court quite accommodating of corruption, their own included. The outcome has been real stolen elections taking place quite openly, and not just with little pushback, but backed by American voters where representatives on both sides are overriding their constituents by contorting district lines and consequently manipulating election outcomes. Parties jockeying for power power over who gets to screw over Americans more. The outcome has been a nationwide influx of laws designed to ensure fewer voters, legislators overriding voters by vetoing citizen-led ballot initiatives, and a Congress that places lobbyists in lining their own pockets over major issues that most Americans support, such as healthcare reform, office age limits, and reining in Congress's insider trading. The outcome has been elected officials totally void of moral foundations, and political parties that use democracy-destroying tactics when they claim to believe that the other party is using them. The outcome has been Americans left with no recourse, where we've effectively been surgically excised from the political process, left with little stake in the country's success or future, and democracy is under attack from all sides. So it's not particularly surprising that Trump, following in the footsteps of presidents like Andrew Jackson, saw an exceedingly vulnerable population desperate to believe, advertised himself as a political outsider, promised to obliterate the perpetual corruption that festers throughout all levels of US government, but instead came to wallow in it like no one prior. Taking advice from his lawyer, mentor, and general scumbag Roy Cohn, who taught him no matter how bad the beating, never admit defeat, advice Trump's followed very consistently for decades now. So Trump called the election stolen and duped much of the country. Trump's stolen election conspiracy blatantly contradicts some of the most ancient wisdom in Western history. Among the first things that you learn as a kid from Aesop's fables, and that's when someone is a habitual liar, you automatically disregard everything that they say, even when they're telling the truth, because that's the only legitimate response. And if you think that you can decipher when he's lying and when he isn't, you're the unwitting sucker in his con game. Though it can be quite easy to confuse the two, Trump isn't himself the disease, he's just a symptom of it. He's a homunculus, American culture incarnate. Like Mark Twain's oft-repeated quote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, nothing that's happening now is new because human nature doesn't change. And from the nation's very outset, presidents like Jefferson and even Adams warned that the political, economic, social circumstances that we're seeing right now were a near inevitability. Though Adams and Jefferson weren't there to take part in it, preventing demagogues from gaining power over the country was a primary focus of America's other founding fathers when they were debating the Constitution in 1787. The problems are much bigger than political parties because American culture is rotting from the inside out. Don't think for a second that if Trump were out of office or if the Democrats were in office, that the country's course would be corrected. Much like the US presidents who fully recognized that their actions were beyond revolting, yet couldn't bring themselves to end slavery because they benefited from it so immensely, you can't depend on Congress to rein itself in because they profit from the circumstances enormously. It's up to you to see the reality of the current situation and how to respond to it. No one can do it for you. And much as many American founders did, the fastest, most reliable way to do that is to study history and human nature, but I'll try to pick out some of the highlights in coming videos.